The thermometer outside Anna's cabin read -28 degrees that January morning in 1845, but inside she sat comfortably at 68 degrees, the massive brick structure radiating steady warmth, though the fire had died hours ago. The silence of the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the howling gale that battered the rough-hewn timber of the exterior walls. In the corner, a basin of water sat perfectly liquid, devoid of the rim of ice that greeted every other settler in the valley upon waking. Anna did not huddle beneath mounds of fur or shiver as her feet touched the floorboards. She moved with a calm, deliberate grace, her hands warm as she poured coffee from a pot that had stayed hot atop the masonry beast that dominated the center of her living space. This structure, a towering monolith of clay, brick, and plaster, seemed to breathe a life of its own, a silent lung that exhaled comfort long after the fuel was consumed. It was not merely a heater. It was a defiant architectural statement against the brutality of the American frontier. Across the ridge, less than a mile away, the situation was drastically different. Silas, a neighbor who prided himself on his adherence to tradition and his hardiness, was currently chipping ice off the inside of his window pane. His breath hung in the air like a thick, white fog, obscuring the dim light of his morning candle. The large, open hearth that occupied the entire north wall of his cabin roared with a voracious appetite, consuming logs as thick as a man's thigh, yet the heat seemed to vanish the moment it was created. Silas stood with his backside to the flames, his trousers scorching while his chest remained dangerously cold. The physics of his survival were flawed. The massive chimney, designed by habit rather than reason, acted as a vacuum, sucking the warm air out of the room and blasting it into the winter sky, replacing it with icy drafts pulled through the chinking of the logs. He rubbed his numb hands together, looking out toward Anna's cabin, where no smoke rose from the chimney. "She's frozen solid, surely," he muttered to his wife, Martha, who was huddled under 3 quilts. "No smoke means no fire. That fool woman has finally done herself in with that monstrosity of hers." He believed, as did the rest of the settlement, that Anna's refusal to build a traditional English hearth was a sign of madness, a grief-stricken folly that would cost her life. They did not understand that the lack of smoke was not a sign of death, but of perfect combustion. The skepticism of the community had been a heavy burden to bear, but Anna sat in her rocker, feeling the radiant energy penetrate her bones. It was a different kind of heat than the harsh, searing burn of an open fire. This was soft, omnipresent, and heavy, like the warmth of the sun on a granite boulder in mid-July. It did not fluctuate with the wind or die down when she slept. The masonry heater, which Silas had laughingly called Anna's tomb during its construction, held the thermal energy of yesterday's short, intense fire and released it slowly, metering it out over 12 hours. She looked at the smooth, plastered surface of the stove, whitewashed and immaculate. It stood in the center of the room, freestanding, allowing the air to circulate around its entire mass. While her neighbors were slaves to their fireplaces, forced to wake every 2 hours to feed the insatiable flames or risk freezing, Anna had slept 8 hours of uninterrupted, dreamless sleep. The vindication was silent, registered only on the thermometer and the ease of her morning routine. She took a sip of her coffee, the heat spreading through her chest, and allowed herself a rare, small smile. The valley outside was a graveyard of cold, but her home was a sanctuary of engineering. The journey to this morning of comfort had begun in tragedy 2 winters prior, in the brutal season of 1843. At that time, Anna had not been a widow, and the cabin had been heated by a standard open hearth, built by her husband, Samuel. Samuel was a good man, strong and capable with an axe, but he was a man of his time, bound by the architectural ancestry of the British Isles. He built what he knew, a wide, shallow fireplace intended for the mild, damp winters of England, not the Siberian intensity of the American interior. The winter of 43 had descended with a ferocity that caught the entire settlement off guard. Temperatures plummeted and stayed low for weeks, turning the sap in the trees to ice and the ground to iron. The open hearth in their cabin became a curse. To keep the temperature above freezing, Samuel had to feed the fire constantly. The draft created by the roaring blaze sucked freezing air through every crack in the walls, creating a cycle of diminishing returns. The harder the fire burned, the stronger the cold drafts became. Samuel had spent his days and nights in a state of exhaustion, swinging the axe to keep up with the hearth's gluttony. The wood supply, which should have lasted until March, was critically low by January. One evening, deep in the throes of a blizzard, Samuel had gone out to fell a dead standing oak near the tree line. He was already weakened by the constant cold and the smoke inhalation that plagued their drafty cabin. Anna remembered the sound of the wind masking the fall of the tree, or perhaps the sound of him falling. He had not returned. When she found him the next morning, he was not crushed by timber, but simply slumped against the trunk, his axe fallen from his frozen grip. The coroner, if there had been one, would have called it heart failure brought on by hypothermia and exhaustion. Anna knew the truth. The fireplace had killed him. It had demanded more energy than it returned. It was a parasite of heat, not a provider. After burying Samuel in the frozen earth, a task that required huge fires to thaw the ground enough to dig, Anna returned to the cold cabin. She sat before the open fire, watching the flames dance and feeling the draft on her neck. The inefficiency of it enraged her. It was a betrayal of physics. She realized that continuing to live this way was a slow suicide. The other families in the valley accepted this suffering as the price of frontier life. They accepted the chilblains, the smoke-filled lungs, and the constant fear of the woodpile running dry. Anna refused. She looked at the blackened stones of the hearth, the soot staining the mantel, and made a vow to the empty room. She would not be a slave to this primitive technology. She would find a way to harness the fire, to master it, or she would leave this valley forever. She extinguished the fire, wrapped herself in every blanket she owned, and began to plan her survival, fueled by a cold, sharp anger that burned hotter than the dying embers. The following spring, Anna did not plant corn or wheat like her neighbors. Instead, she saddled her remaining horse and rode south, toward a settlement of German immigrants she had heard mentioned by passing traders. The neighbors, Silas included, watched her go with pitying shakes of their heads. Running away from the memories, Silas told the men at the general store. Can't blame her. A woman alone can't manage a homestead. They assumed she was retreating to civilization, defeated. They were wrong. Anna was not fleeing. She was hunting. She was hunting for knowledge that had been lost or ignored by the Anglo-American settlers. She was seeking the Hafner, the stove mason. She found him in a small, orderly hamlet where the houses looked strange to her eyes, thick walls, small windows, and central chimneys. His name was Herr Muller, a man whose skin was textured like old parchment and whose hands were permanently dusted with clay. When Anna entered his home, she was struck instantly by the atmosphere. It was a cool, damp spring day, yet the air inside was uniformly warm, possessing a stillness she had never experienced. There was no roar of fire, no smell of smoke, only a towering structure of glazed tiles in the center of the room. Muller listened to her broken explanation, her desperate request for a way to survive the cold without working herself to death. He did not dismiss her because she was a woman. He listened with the intense, calculating gaze of an engineer. The English fire, Muller said, his voice gravelly, pointing to a diagram on his table. It is a pump. Pumps warm air out of the house. You heat the birds, not your toes. He explained the principle of the Kachelofen, the masonry heater. He spoke of thermal mass, a concept foreign to Anna but intuitively correct. He explained that wood contains a specific amount of energy, and the goal is to burn it hot and fast to release that energy, then capture the gas in a labyrinth of stone before it escapes up the chimney. You must catch the ghost of the fire, he told her. The smoke must be made to walk, not run for 3 weeks. Anna stayed in the settlement. She traded her horse for a wagon load of specialized materials: firebrick, heavy clay, and iron doors. But the most valuable thing she acquired was not physical. It was the set of drawings Muller sketched for her, and the understanding of the internal architecture of heat. She learned about the firebox, the throat, the bell, and the channels. She learned that weight was her friend and that speed was her enemy. When Anna returned to the valley, the wagon creaking under the immense weight of the dense clay bricks, the reception was less than warm. The summer heat was in full swing, and her neighbors were busy with their crops. They stopped their work to watch her struggle the heavy wagon up the trail to her cabin. Silas walked over, wiping sweat from his brow, and kicked one of the wagon wheels. "Bringing back rocks, Anna?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "We have plenty of rocks here. Seems a waste of a good horse." He peered into the wagon bed, seeing the sacks of lime and the strange, high-density bricks Muller had provided. "You planning to build a fortress? Expecting a war?" "I am building a stove," Anna replied, her voice flat and unyielding. She climbed down, her boots hitting the dust with a thud. She began to unhitch the team, ignoring his amusement. "A stove?" Silas laughed, looking at the sheer volume of material. "That's enough brick for 3 chimneys. You'll burn the cabin down with something that big, or you'll fall through the floor. It's a folly, Anna. A widow's folly." He turned to the other men who had gathered. "She thinks she can reinvent fire." The men chuckled, a low rumble of masculine dismissal. They saw a woman stepping outside her sphere, dabbling in masonry and physics, domains reserved for men. They saw waste. Anna saw only the future. The demolition of the old hearth was the first scandal. Anna took a sledgehammer to Samuel's work, tearing out the stone fireplace that had anchored the room. The neighbors whispered that she was desecrating his memory. But Anna knew she was exorcising the thing that killed him. Once the wall was patched, she did not build against it. She moved to the center of the room. She cut a hole in the floorboards, digging down into the earth beneath the cabin to pour a massive footer of stone and concrete. The heater would weigh nearly 3 tons. It needed a foundation independent of the cabin's wooden frame. Muller had been emphatic about this. "If the house moves, the heater must not," he had said. "It stands alone." She mixed the mortar herself, a precise recipe of sand, clay, and water, testing the consistency with her fingers until it felt like stiff butter. She worked long days, her hands growing rough and calloused, her dress stained with gray mud. The physical labor was grueling, lifting the heavy stones and positioning them with exactitude. There could be no air gaps, no shifting. She used a plumb line constantly, obsessing over the verticality of the structure. To the onlookers peering through her windows, it looked like she was building a crypt in the middle of her living room. It was a rectangular block, growing slowly, layer by layer. It was not elegant yet. It was brutish and imposing. Silas stopped by occasionally to offer unsolicited advice. "You're blocking the flow of the room," he said, gesturing to the space the foundation consumed. "Where will you put the table? You're letting a pile of bricks dictate how you live." "I am letting the warmth dictate how I live," Anna answered, troweling a layer of mortar with a rhythmic sound. She did not look up. "You build your life around the cold, Silas. You hide from it. I intend to conquer it." The construction entered its most critical phase. The internal channels. This was the secret heart of the machine, the part the skeptics could not see and therefore could not understand. A standard fireplace was a simple box. Fire goes in, smoke goes up. Anna's stove was a labyrinth. Using the high-temperature firebricks from Muller, she began to construct a winding path for the exhaust gases. She built a firebox that was deceptively small, insulated heavily to ensure temperatures would reach over 1,500 degrees. From there, she laid the bricks for the flue, but instead of going straight up, the channel turned. It went sideways, then down, then back up again in a serpentine pattern. Silas, emboldened by the absurdity of the design, brought his cousin Jed to see the spectacle. They stood in the doorway, watching Anna carefully place a brick that seemed to block the chimney path. "Look at that," Jed scoffed, spitting tobacco juice onto the grass outside. "She's choking it. Smoke rises, woman. That's the law of nature. You try to force smoke to go down, you're gonna fill this house with soot. You'll be smoked like a ham by November. It works by draft and pressure," Anna said, her voice echoing slightly from inside the firebox where she was pointing the joints. Hot gas expands. As it cools, it contracts. The cooling gas pulls the hot gas behind it. It creates a vacuum. Vacuum, Silas snorted. Fancy words for a death trap. You're building a coffin, Anna. Mark my words. When the first blizzard hits, you'll be freezing because you can't get a fire to draw in that maze. Anna ignored them, but her hand trembled slightly as she laid the next brick. The theory was sound, Muller had promised. But the stakes were absolute. If the channels were too narrow, the smoke would back up. If they were too wide, the velocity would drop and the draft would die. Every brick had to be placed with the precision of a watchmaker. She was not just stacking stones. She was sculpting the airflow. She was visualizing the invisible stream of heat, forcing it to rub against the masonry, transferring its energy into the heavy brick mass before it was allowed to escape. It was an act of faith in the laws of thermodynamics. She worked into the night by candlelight, the shadows of the rising monolith stretching across the walls. She could feel the weight of the town's judgment, a cold pressure pressing in from the outside, but as she smoothed the clay inside the dark, twisting throat of the stove, she felt a strange sense of companionship with the materials. They were solid. They were true. Unlike the fickle open fire, this stone beast would not lie to her. If she built it right, it would protect her. If she failed, she would freeze. There was no middle ground. By late September, the skeletal structure of the stove was complete, a rough, menacing hulk of dark firebrick standing in the center of the room. But the work was far from finished. The internal organs of the beast, the firebox, the throat, and the serpentine flue channels were hidden now, encased in the outer shell. Now came the skin. Anna spent days sifting sand through a fine wire mesh she had fashioned from an old grain sieve, separating the coarse pebbles from the fine silica. She needed a plaster that would expand and contract with the thermal pulse of the masonry without cracking. She mixed lime, fine sand, and chopped straw, turning the paste over and over until it achieved a creamy, homogeneous texture. The application was a meditation in patience. Using a flat steel trowel, she spread the plaster over the rough bricks, smoothing the surface until it was seamless. She rounded the corners, softening the brutal geometry of the block into something organic and inviting. It took 3 coats, each one needing to dry to a specific level of tackiness before the next could be applied. While she worked the trowel, the rhythmic scrape-slap-scrape filling the quiet cabin, the sounds of the valley outside shifted. The cicadas fell silent, replaced by the frenetic activity of squirrels and the ominous, dry rattle of falling leaves. The neighbors were engaged in their own frantic preparations, a ritual of panic that defined the frontier autumn. From dawn until dusk, the sound of axes biting into hardwood echoed off the canyon walls. Silas and the other men were building woodpiles that resembled defensive fortifications. They kneaded cords upon cords of timber, massive, split logs that would burn fast and hot in their open hearths. They were preparing to feed a beast that had an unquenchable hunger. Anna, by contrast, had a modest pile of wood, perhaps a quarter of what Silas had gathered. Furthermore, her wood was different. She had cut it months ago, splitting it into small, uniform pieces, no thicker than her wrist. She stacked it in a crib pattern to allow maximum airflow, drying it until it was light as balsa. Silas, passing by with his wagon groaning under the weight of green oak, stopped to gawk at her meager supply. "You planning to heat the house with toothpicks, Anna?" he called out, his breath pluming in the crisp morning air. "That little pile won't last you past Christmas. You'll be burning your furniture by January." "Surface area," Anna murmured to herself, not bothering to shout back. She wiped a smudge of lime from her cheek. She knew that for the masonry heater to work, the fire needed to burn violently hot and incredibly fast. Big logs smoldered. Small, dry wood detonated. The energy had to be released in a burst, charging the thermal battery of the bricks, rather than a slow, smoky burn. She was playing a different game entirely, one based on intensity rather than duration. October brought the first hard frosts, transforming the valley into a landscape of silver and gray, and with it came the critical phase of curing the stove. This was the test of Anna's discipline. The massive structure contained hundreds of gallons of water trapped within the mortar and the damp bricks. If she were to light a roaring fire now, the water would flash into steam, expanding with explosive force and cracking the monolith from the inside out. The stove had to be woken up gently. For 2 weeks, while her neighbors were already stoking their hearths against the creeping chill, Anna burned nothing but handfuls of newspaper and small twigs in the firebox. The fires were pathetic, barely enough to warm her hands, let alone the room. The smoke that drifted from her chimney was wispy and thin, disappearing almost instantly. To the outside observer, it looked like failure. It looked like the stove wouldn't draw, like she couldn't get a proper blaze going. Inside the cabin, it was cold. Anna wore her wool coat and fingerless gloves as she sat by the stove, feeding it tiny meals of kindling. She could hear the structure settling, the faint tink-tink sounds of thermal expansion as the moisture was slowly driven out of the deep masonry. She touched the side of the heater constantly, feeling for the dampness, waiting for the plaster to cure to a bone-dry white. It was a miserable fortnight. Silas's wife, Martha, came by one afternoon with a pot of stew, her face pinched with concern. The cabin was chilly, hovering just around 50 degrees. "Oh, Anna," Martha whispered, looking at the cold, white monument in the center of the room. "It doesn't work, does it?" Silas said, "The draft is all wrong. You can't even get a log to catch. Please, come stay with us when the snow hits. Don't let pride kill you." "It works," Anna said, her voice tight. She accepted the stew but refused the pity. "It is drying. Stone takes time. Trust takes time." "We're worried," Martha insisted, pulling her shawl tighter. "Silas says you've built an icebox, not a stove. He says the bricks are stealing the heat." "The bricks are learning to hold it," Anna corrected. "Tell Silas to worry about his own chimney. I see the soot build up from here. He's burning wet wood." Martha left, shaking her head, convinced she had just visited a tomb in the making. Anna locked the door and placed her hand on the plaster. It was faintly, barely warm, a ghost of heat. "Soon," she whispered. The Great White Death, as the elders would later call it, arrived on November 12th. It didn't start with snow. It started with a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the world. Then came the wind, a low, vibrating hum that grew into a scream, driving a wall of Arctic air down from the Canadian Shield. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. By sunset, the snow was falling horizontally, hard little pellets that scoured the wood of the cabins like sandpaper. This was the test. The curing was done. The moisture was gone. It was time for the first full burn. Anna went to her woodpile and brought in an armload of the dry, wrist-thick splits. She opened the heavy iron door of the firebox. It was deep and narrow. She did not arrange the wood in a teepee or a log cabin style. She packed it tight, filling the box almost to the top, but crucially, she lit the fire at the very top of the pile. This was the top-down burn, another secret Muller had taught her. By lighting the top, the fire would burn downward like a candle, preheating the wood below before it ignited, ensuring complete combustion of the gases. She struck the match and watched the flame catch the birch bark kindling. The draft roared. It wasn't the lazy crackle of a fireplace. It was the sound of a jet engine engaging. The air rushed into the intake vents, feeding the flames which grew rapidly, turning from orange to a blinding, transparent blue-white. The heat inside the firebox skyrocketed. Anna watched through the small mica window in the door. The fire was violent, terrifyingly contained. It consumed the wood with a ferocity she had never seen. In an open hearth, this heat would be lost, flying up the chimney to warm the stars. But here, the heat slammed into the roof of the firebox, was forced sideways, then down through the channels she had painstakingly built. The smoke, laden with heat, was being tortured, forced to give up its energy to the bricks before it was allowed to leave. The stove began to make sounds, deep, resonant thrums as the masonry absorbed the thermal shock. For 2 hours the fire raged. Anna did not add more wood. She let the load burn down completely until all that remained was a bed of glowing, white-hot coals. Then she did the unthinkable. She closed the damper. In a normal fireplace, closing the flue while coals were hot would fill the room with deadly carbon monoxide. But the combustion here had been so complete, so perfect, that there was nothing left but pure heat. She sealed the iron door and turned the handle on the chimney damper, effectively bottling the genie. The noise stopped. The roar faded to silence. The fire was out. To anyone watching from the outside, the show was over. But for the stove, the work was just beginning. The 3 tons of brick had absorbed the intensity of the 2-hour burn. Now, soaked with energy, the mass began to radiate. It started as a gentle presence, then grew into a physical force. The white plaster surface became too hot to touch. The air in the room didn't move in drafts. It simply thickened with warmth. It was a radiant heat, infrared and penetrating, that soaked into the floorboards, the furniture, and Anna's own skin. Outside, the wind howled like a banshee, battering the walls, but inside, the thermometer began to climb. 50 degrees, 60 degrees, 65 degrees. Anna sat in her rocker, the storm raging inches away, and unbuttoned her collar. She was safe. The storm raged for 3 days without pause. The valley was buried under 5 feet of drift, the landmarks erased, the world reduced to white blindness. On the second night, a frantic pounding shook Anna's door. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but insistent. She opened it to a swirl of snow and a figure stumbling in, wrapped in frozen blankets. It was Silas. He fell onto the floorboards, his eyebrows caked in ice, his lips blue. He was shaking so violently he couldn't speak. Behind him, dim shapes in the snow, Martha and their children, were huddled together. Anna didn't ask questions. She pulled them inside, one by one, sealing the heavy door against the gale. The moment they entered the room, the shock hit them. It wasn't just warm. It was tropical compared to the hellscape outside. Silas gasped, the air searing his frozen lungs. He looked at the fireplace, expecting to see a bonfire, a roaring inferno consuming whole trees. He saw nothing. The iron door of the stove was shut. There was no fire. The room was silent. Yet the heat was everywhere. It radiated from the white monolith in the center of the room like a localized sun. Silas dragged himself toward it, reaching out a trembling hand. He stopped inches from the plaster, feeling the wave of energy pouring off the bricks. He looked at Anna, his eyes wide with confusion and a dawning, crushing realization. Where, he stammered, his teeth chattering. Where is the fire? It's out. Why is it hot? The fire was yesterday, Anna said softly, handing Martha a mug of warm water from the basin atop the stove. You are feeling the memory of the fire, Silas. The family huddled around the masonry heater, pressing their backs as close as they dared. Their clothes steamed as the ice melted. Silas looked around the room. He saw Anna's small pile of wood, barely touched. He thought of his own empty woodshed, the logs he had burned in a futile attempt to heat the sky, the freezing drafts that had driven his family out into the storm. He looked at the folly he had mocked, the tomb he had laughed at. He realized now that he was the one who had been living in a tomb. The silence of the room was heavy, not with tension, but with the weight of his error. The physics didn't care about his tradition or his pride. The physics only cared that he was wrong, and she was right. Decades passed. The frontier moved west, the Civil War came and went, and the railroads carved up the land. Anna lived in the cabin until she was 82, passing away in her sleep on a cold February night, warm in her bed. The cabin, built of wood, eventually succumbed to the rot of the earth. The roof collapsed in 1910. The walls dissolved into humus by the 1930s. The forest reclaimed the clearing, growing over the garden and the path. But the stove remained. It stood amongst the saplings and the ferns, a strange white obelisk rising from the ruin. The plaster flaked away, revealing the red firebrick and the intricate masonry work underneath, but the core held. Hunters stumbling upon it in the 1950s marveled at the strange chimney that didn't look like a chimney, the complex channels exposed like the cross-section of a living organism. They poked at the iron door, rusted shut, unaware that they were looking at a masterpiece of thermal engineering. It stood as a monument to efficiency in a land of excess. It remained long after the skeptics were forgotten, long after the mockers had turned to dust. It was a testament to the day one woman decided to stop fighting the cold with brute force and started fighting it with reason. Even in its ruin, stripped of its shelter, the masonry heater possessed a quiet dignity. On sunny days, the heavy thermal mass would absorb the heat of the sun, and well into the cool evenings, if a wanderer were to place their hand upon the mossy bricks, they would find them faintly, stubbornly warm, a lingering echo of the salvation it had once provided.